Good evening, gamers, and welcome to a very long overdue talk on Games with Dave. Tonight, I'm joined by my pal, Matthew Funk from Pleas Publishing. Matthew is the co-founder of Pleas, and they are currently running a Kickstarter for a holiday bundle of all their adventures from the Tale of Two Sisters adventure path, with, I guess you'd say, a focus on the final two being Hunters of the Goblin Grove and the Feast of the Goblin Winter. You can find the link in the description, but kick back and have fun with us and ask any questions and enjoy our Thanksgiving Eve chat. How are you, man?
I'm absolutely fabulous, Dave. Thank you. It's really exciting times. I moved recently into a place that we've dreamt of being for a very, very long time. Found wonderful people here that are supportive in the gaming community. And as you said, like, there's a lot going on as far as Pleas Publishing is concerned. So exhilarating times.
I'm so glad we finally get to talk because we've tried almost every time you've had a Kickstarter, and I'm kind of a scatterbrain, so it would kind of just come into my head and go out, and we never made it happen. And we finally made it happen. I'm so excited.
We did.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, like, I hope this becomes a regular thing. I mean, I feel like we could just shoot the breeze for a really long time, given what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, we just spent the last 15 minutes shooting the breeze about this, that, and everything, and it felt like 2 minutes passed. And we've also spent a lot of time going back and forth through chat and email the last couple of weeks, so I feel like we've just had that that like quick click like I have with some people. And so one thing I didn't know, in addition to being a crafter of fine DCC tales, you're also a young adult historical fiction author and short story writer. What can you tell folks about that part of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think the through line is that I have always wanted to tell stories of meaning. And the more interactive, the better, I'm coming to learn. I'm finding that's another passion of mine. But those particular areas were that when I first started to seek fiction publication, I got involved in crime writing because I felt it had some great social significance. As a topic, you have the ability to talk about social issues more so than other genres, though of course spec-fic and has its attraction. And I got involved mostly with like online short story publication. That isn't to say that a lot of it wasn't in print. Ultimately, I was in print, and I was that close to having a published novel. It's heartbreaking. It was bought by a place, and then that fell through, and then another place bought it, and that place in turn fell through. But after that, after the crime writing, I shifted genres largely because I wanted to tell other kinds of stories. And ultimately, the young adult historical fiction was that I'm absolutely enamored with a culture called the Scythians, which were a pastoralist plains culture that stretched all the way from what would be like South Siberia to modern day Hungary. And they were an amazing people. And I think that they are especially relevant today as a lot of people, especially in the Western world, are exploring, for lack of a better term, like alternate lifestyles, ways of valuing things differently, ways of interacting with the natural world differently, ways of perceiving identity differently. The Scythians, who were contemporaneous to what we consider to be like the golden age of Greece at their height, were really taking those topics and pursuing them a totally different way. So I found it interesting writing a young adult novel set in that world.
Very cool. I could probably talk your ear off about the Scythians for hours. I've actually never heard of the civilization. So yeah, but we're going to get to,
they're amazing.
We're going to get to DCC.
Let's do it.
So for anyone living on the outskirts of Thorpe, we'll say, that may not have heard of A Tale of Two Sisters, can you give kind of a rundown of what the adventure path is all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was blessed to hear about the Goodman Games relationship to third-party publishers, and by that I mean that they are very, very receptive and encouraging to third-party publication, and even go so far as to actively promote third-party projects. I was like, okay, I need to do something of significance with this. And that leads to a whole different Witch Pleas conversation. But in terms of what A Tale of Two Sisters is, it was a choice of product positioning, where I said, okay, I want to get known to the market, but not overnight and not artificially. So we're going to have this build steadily. I'm going to do like this series of adventures, in essence, a campaign. And I was going to position it for two markets. One is, which I've yet to publish, it's called Descent of the Ancient Fane. That's going to be coming out next year. Is much more oriented to that kind of classic dungeon crawl experience of like, here's a grid with a succession of rooms, traps, and opponents. Go through it. And it's not to say that it won't have that kind of educational aspect and the depth that I try and bring to Witch Pleas work. But Tale of Two Sisters was one where I looked at it and said, okay, it's not that DCC is bereft of role-playing in the sense of like inhabiting your character and developing a story, but I'd love to come up with a series of modules that enables that. And so the concept of A Tale of Two Sisters is that it starts off when the nominal two sisters are around 12 to 13 years old. They are in peril, and the PCs go to in essence, save them in the first adventure. That's Champions of the Goblin Market, the level 0. And every adventure kind of checks in with them as they grow. And so if you're playing it, you can, in essence, stick with these NPCs in the town of Thorpe, seeing what happens to them and seeing them develop as heroes. And I think last but not least, I should mention that I paced it out so that there's not much time between the 0 and the 1 adventure. And similarly, between the 1 and the 2, there's only like a year or so. But then it gets wider so that judges can put adventures between them, that they don't, in essence, have to do just one A Tale of Two Sisters adventure after another. You can kind of slip in other adventures between that and check back in with the story. The story ultimately is inspired by a couple things. One of them being Goblin Market, but it really drew from 3 inspirations as far as the title and then the main characters in it. Or the central NPCs, I should say.
Yeah, it seems like you really drew your inspiration a lot from like classical tales. What would you say your 3 biggest, I'm guessing you're a bibliophile for one. So I
try to point at the right side of the screen, but yes, bibliophile. Yes.
So out of your love of books, which would you say are the 3 classic novels that influenced this adventure path the most?
That influenced this adventure path. Okay, so many of them aren't really novels per se. So Goblin Market is most certainly the one that influenced the entire adventure path and pretty much is the genesis of Champions of the Goblin Market. And that's a 19th century poem by an author by the name of Christina Rossetti. And one cool thing is that I include excerpts from the works that inspire all of these adventures in the work so that people who are playing it can be like, oh, I wonder where this came from, and then learn something about these past works of literature that I'd love to like push back into the spotlight. But I would say, so number 1 is Goblin Market, which is, I think, ahead of its time in the sense that it's all about toxic masculinity. It addresses these 2 young women who are coming of age and their relationship with these goblins that are tempting the girls of the village with their fruit, and basically shows like you don't need to succumb to the temptations of these like boorish, loutish, nasty goblin men who are, entreating you to taste their fruit. You can, in essence, avoid them and stick with your sister and be strong together. In essence, so it's basically like not giving in to toxic masculinity, which I think was, again, ahead of its time in the mid-19th century when it was written. The other work is Canterbury's Tales. That was really at the core of what I was trying to do with Pilgrims of the Goblin Road in the second one. But I think that it pervades the entire work Thank you, sir. It pervades the entire adventure path because one thing I did is I didn't want NPCs to not have a rich story. So if you consider Pilgrims of the Goblin Road, one thing that I do there, which I think that judges might find helpful, is that I have a roster of backstories. So if a player comes to the table and doesn't have a backstory or a reason that they're going to go on the pilgrimage that's central in the adventure, they can roll on the roster of reasons and have this backstory. And the adventure, in essence, starts with the players all sharing what their backstory is. That doesn't mean they can't lie. I, in fact, count on some of them to do so. And some of those agendas may conflict. But again, it comes back to that notion of Canterbury Tales, where in a journey, people are coming together and sharing their individual stories. And this is manifest in Feast of the Goblin Winter in that I emulated that OSR or sort of approach to the village in the sense that I kind of labeled every little town, a little village in every little building in Thorpe. But I also gave the major NPCs at those places a backstory with an adventure hook. So
nice.
Let's say you go to see the local ostler. Well, she has a deep backstory. And if players really want to get to know her and figure out what's bothering Jolene Mankin, well, by gosh, like Jolene can loop you into this long story that involves the King of Elfland and so on and so forth. And it's the same for the guy that runs the trading post, and it's the same for the guy that, does, well, the cheesemaker is actually a woman, but neither here nor there. So backstories. And I would say that the last work that really heavily influences it is one that's yet to actually see the adventure path, and that is The Fairy Queen by Spencer. So this was written around Tudor times, in many ways like a paean to Queen Elizabeth. But why it's relevant is that it basically is like a Dungeons and Dragons or DCC or Pathfinder kind of narrative. It's a poem, and the thing's huge, but basically it's just like the story of these various adventurers fighting sorcerers and trolls and dragons, and it's just like this never-ending interweaving narrative of what I would characterize as like modern fantasy genre adventures. And so what I'm trying to do with this setting overall is have the monsters, the morality, the culture, the spells and so forth all speak to that authentic, like late medieval or early Renaissance or even earlier, like Dark Ages kind of beliefs. So in some ways that means it's divergent from how we see fantasy, because often if we're looking at, again, D&D or something, we see it through the lens of like modernized fantasy, like Tolkien as a for instance.
Right.
His perception of elves and dwarves and so forth. Whereas what I'm trying to do in the overall lore and campaign setting, of which A Tale of Two Sisters is a part, is really bring up the old beliefs and make it as scholarly authentic as possible.
Awesome. Man, you just set me up with so many potential segues for other talking points. Now I've got to decide which one I want to go with. I mean, really, you brought up the Fairy Queen, which instantly makes my head say Fae because of it being the Fairy Queen. And one of the places you're taking folks in the two new modules is the Hinterwoods.
Yes.
And that's more in Hunters of the Goblin Grove, if I remember in reading.
That's correct. Yeah.
Can you explain to folks watching just what the ever-changing Hinterwoods are?
Yeah, absolutely. So in these two bundle modules, I wanted to include campaign setting material that really fleshes out the environment, so that if a party or a judge wanted to take things in a direction different from the module, or perhaps wanted to use that environment over again, they would have deep resources. Part of it is kind of a nod to what I aim to achieve late next year for the campaign setting. And part of it is just like, I think it makes for a really cool module. And it feels very old school to me to have like the depth to the environment available for people, as opposed to just this linear narrative. Now, specifically with the Hinterwoods, The reason why it's ever changing is that the characters enter it on Samhain Eve. And so it is always a place that you're going to encounter some sort of mysticism or odd creatures if you're not careful. In Samhain Eve, you shouldn't go there at all. But basically, events force the players, or at least push them, I should say, quite convincingly into the Hinterwoods. And the way it shifts is this, and I take this somewhat from, again, the old legends of Fae. And by old, I mean Dark Ages and beforehand in the Celtic tradition and somewhat in the Germanic tradition. The trees themselves, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, so if you're going to play this, you might want to plug your ears, but the trees themselves dictate what the locations look like. So if you go in there and you're like, oh, I want to move towards the oak trees, you're going to get something because oaks are quite sacred and they're like these amazingly magical trees in those two cultures' mythologies. That's very high fantasy. You'll like practically be walking through Elfland and you'll see like these tall elves resplendent in chromatic costume partying together, and there are forest creatures. It's this very high magic benevolent thing. On the other hand, if you go towards the yew trees, and yew trees are supposed to be so dark that back in the Dark Ages, they actually believed that if you slept in the shadow of a yew tree, you'd die. You go that path, and you're getting a very heavily corrupt experience with like everything sagging and rotting and stinking, and there are trolls everywhere and nasty creatures that you'll come across. Well, in order to get to the ultimate destination, characters kind of have to navigate between these worlds, and they need to figure out what's guiding them. And there are certain spirit guides along the way who will give hints as to how you can navigate this and whatnot. So it's not entirely random, but I'd imagine that two things will happen. One, people will find that this unfolds in a way that's surprising to them, because I've yet to encounter this in an adventure. And two, it seems to, given my play tests, evolve in very different ways each time.
That sounds so cool. And I got to tell you, it instantly made me picture Shang-Chi when they're going through the forest at the end of the movie to find the village, and the trees just opening up and being like, you're following this path now, and hurry up before we eat you.
Yes. And there's an element of eeriness. I mean, I hope it's conveyed through the writing, and certainly I ran it this way, that when the characters, I should say the characters, but it's really the players, choose these paths and see things changing, and they're not entirely sure why, and they're kind of arriving back at the same place, but it looks slightly different. There's this moment where you can almost feel it sink into the players, as you know, the subtleness of it reveals what the actual mystery is, and it's nice. It's nice.
That sounds so cool. Like, I can't wait to throw players into the Hinterwoods. It's going to be so fun to just be like what is going on here, until they really figure out exactly what is going on there. And,
indeed.
Another thing you're doing is you're introducing a really cool item, and I believe it was in Feast, the Singing Doom.
Yes. Singing Doom's in the end of Hunters, but you're
okay.
Yeah.
So I was almost there.
Right.
And what made me think of that was you saying the older tales of elves and dwarves and stuff like that, because Singing Doom has a particular effect on elves and dwarves in Hunters.
Right.
Can you kind of expand upon that a little bit without giving more away than what you have in the Kickstarter?
I am going to give so much away. I'm going to be shameless right now, because I really like talking about this, and it's something that's, I think, subtle within the module. It'll be revealed fully in lore, but here we go. So one of the things that is behind the story of Singing Doom, which basically is a great sword that when you sweep it around, as you say, it's the bane of dwarves and elves to a great degree, and it is it makes this horrible screaming noises and so forth. It shrieks horribly with, you know, the souls of the slain as you wield it, and can actually inflict damage from that. The story is that if you look back at how elves, dwarves, and to a lesser extent, giants have evolved through mythology, ancient Nordic mythology and Germanic mythology have dwarves and elves nearly godlike. And in some cases, like if we look at, for instance, the story of Thor's hammer, the dwarves are just as powerful as the gods when it comes to like what they're creating. Well, fast forward 1,500, 2,000 years to what I would consider to be, again, that early Renaissance period, and dwarves and goblins and so forth were almost like laughable creatures. They're not particularly dreadful. They might live in your barn, like Rumpelstiltskin caused some trouble, so on and so forth. But they've fallen from power in a lot of ways as to what they used to be, being able to forge like the Ring of the Nibelung and Mjolnir and so forth.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, okay, there's this wonderful story there, especially with DCC's concept of corruption. And so in the world of lore, it's basically that elves and dwarves and goblins, or excuse me, elves and dwarves, I should say, once were these very, very powerful beings. But as humanity took over and as the mundane world asserted itself, they fragmented. And in many ways, like elves have kind of retreated in my setting to the places like the Hinterwoods, to sky castles, to under the sea. Dwarves characteristically have gone under the ground. Now, the difference between the dwarves and the goblins, because goblins in DCC are lawful as well, is that the goblins are in effect the dwarven species that have given over to corruption, that have given over to the primitive, that have, in essence, in exchange for power, given over to that dark side of the existence. And so the characters actually meet the NPC that wields Singing Doom when they're going through the Oak Path. He's this elven lord that at the time is very friendly with them, though he's rather cruel as well. And one could get a sense that, you know, later on when they encounter him in the, I should say, the contemporary time, when they reach him at the end of the module, they could see that he would eventually become that kind of sadist, that corrupt sadist. And so Singing Doom, in essence, is a declaration of how he has turned against his fellow Fey folk, you know, turned against the elves, turned against the dwarves, and is using their souls, in essence, to power this horrible artifact.
Yeah, because I read that and I'm like, man, that is a dark weapon. Like, I could just picture like this glowing red blade of like, you know, the corrupted kyber crystal, basically.
Yes.
For lack of a better way of like describing it in my mind, of it just being just this villainous weapon. And I'm like, dang, that would be so weird to wield that, just because of what can be done with it in terms of like the bleeding and everything.
Oh yeah,
that I read in there. And I'm just like, man, you better hope like if you have a dwarf in your party that they're not like, dude, what are you doing with that? You know?
Exactly.
Let's see, where do I want to go next? Another thing that you're really good with in all of these is tables.
Thank you.
You are fantastic with the tables, which I'm going to touch on a couple times here tonight. But how many tables are contained both within the 2 new adventures?
Oh my goodness.
And the overarching 5, if you can even think of how many are in there. And what are a couple of your favorite tables that you've designed for this AP?
Oh, wow. Okay. So I would say that in terms of the count of them, there's probably around 24 between the 2 books. And I threw that in there, one, because DCC has really made me love tables again.
Yeah.
You know, like they have some really awesome random tables. And so I was thinking about, okay, as a judge, not only running this adventure, but running adventures in general, what are some of the questions that I get? from the players. And I mean like explicit questions and also the implicit questions raised by their actions. And how do I provide rich answers to that? So I would say that my favorite tables are, I have a table of the cost of demonic bargains, because when you run across this gambler in the inn at Thorpe, who he basically is on the run from demons that he's done some dark bargains with. So I was like, this is an opportunity to address the increasingly frequent question of like, can I, in essence, sell part of my soul or like some money or do a dark deed and get something in return from demonic forces? So that was a fun table to write. I have to say that there's another table about mounts and exotic mounts where like you can come up with the cost of armored barding for your dog and whatnot. Like putting that in there was fun. But and you can probably guess this, me being a storyteller, my favorite ones are the tables that have like actual story hooks in them. So I have one table where if you're looking to thieves guilds, like if you're trying to get involved with thieves guilds, it's like exclusively thieves guilds adventure hooks. And there are right now 3 primary thieves guilds, one of which is lawful, one of which is chaotic, and one of which is neutral. And so there are adventure hooks in there, enough just to inspire the GM or the judge. And then there's another one that has similar hooks involving the power elite, and the various like unseen conspiracies that rule this area of the world. That was fun to write. And then you refer back again to Hunters of the Goblin Grove. I got to write little backstories for a lot of the wandering monsters there, which are also on a table. But the last thing I'll say about tables, well, until you ask me other questions about tables, is that I was having a conversation with Stefan Surat from Dragon Peak Publishing the other day about how I came up with 240 entries for the encounter table for the Hunters of the Goblin Grove. And I explained that the way it works is kind of nifty. At least I think so. So here we go. It has 8 different kinds of things that you can seek out in the Hinterwoods. You can the higher the difficulty class. Allow me to rephrase. The more exotic or rare those things are, the higher the difficulty class of a scout trying to find them. So you can either like randomly stumble across them by rolling this table of the 8 categories of things, or you can actually be like, I want to go find like a rare monster, or I want to go find like a legendary site, and then you roll a difficulty class against that. Well, those 8 categories have within them 30 different results. So you might have 30 results under a classification that I call like oddities, which is just like weird stuff that you could come across. It's like from a David Lynch film or, you know, like Elfland kind of stuff. And then there's like random monsters, there's artifacts, lost sites, so on and so forth.
Very
so I like
cool.
how I made that one.
That sounds very intense, making that table. The table I was more enamored with reading about was the 200 adventure hooks. Like, how does your brain come up with 200 adventure hooks? I can't wrap my brain around that.
So a lot of it is just from the books right there. You know, it's like I read as much as possible about folklore and legendary. You know, if I wake up early in the morning and it's too early and I don't want to disturb my wife, I'm going to get on my Kindle and I'm going to start reading stuff about fables and whatnot. So it's really just saturating myself with those ideas and those images. And often I'll go ahead and just make notes of them and just like jot down on my phone like random stuff. Because to your point about 200 something adventure encounter ideas, like you never know when you're going to need it. So
yeah, you don't.
Yeah,
that is just crazy. I read that on the Kickstarter page and I'm like, 200 adventure hooks. I'm like, I can barely come up with like 5 on my own. Let's see. One of the cool things about all of these adventures in the path is the art. And I know you've worked really closely with Stefan Pogue. And the big thing I think with this Kickstarter is the map of Thorpe.
Yeah.
Could you kind of talk a bit about that and what
Yeah,
folks will get if they get it as an add-on or as part of their pledge?
Yeah, and I think stepping into that topic, there's something that I would love to address, which kind of is de rigueur to the conversation we were having prior to this, and have on and off for the last few days, which is namely that this whole entire experience with Dungeon Crawl Classics and developing Which Pleas and so forth has really reinforced that attitude of finding blessings in things that feel very, very bad. I need to say that I owe so much to my artists. Stefan is a wonderful artist, but he's also an amazing human being. He's like a really nice guy. He's dependable. I'd like to say I can count him as a friend. And certainly the other artists that have come aboard the Witch Please team are similarly like enthusiastic, engaged. They're wonderful people and wonderful to work with, and certainly do wonderful art. And I would not have found them had I not colossally screwed up on Champions of the Goblin Market, which is to say that when I first started it, and again, to go back to that notion of like, my genesis was like reaching out to Goodman Games and being like, oh, I have my little module, like maybe I could publish this. And they instead like showed me a better way. I thought I was going to be doing it as a one-man band. And so admittedly, I was like, you know what? I use Midjourney at work. I'm going to whip up some AI art. And rightly so, the community like shredded me for it. But there were people like Bob Brinkman, like Harley Stroh, like Joe, that came out of this, in essence, this pantheon that I'd established. Because I'd read all the DCC adventures, I'd played a number of them. They came down and were like, listen, man, it's all good. You know, chin up. We're going to find a way forward. And they were the ones that introduced me ultimately to Stefan. And Stefan, as I say at the outset, like I owe so much to his artwork and whatnot. So it really goes to speak that like we really don't know ultimately where tragedy or setbacks or uncomfortable situations will take us. And it's been my experience over the past year to be blessed to say that it's taken me some really cool places whenever I've made mistakes, largely because they're great people, you know, much like yourself, but like a lot of people in the community who step in to like lift me up. So I think that was worth saying. Now, that said, your question was about the artwork in it. I know I went on a bit of a tangent. We discussed. I'm a little bit like ectoplasm up here, but what were you saying? What was your question?
If you could just kind of
steer to where I wanted.
You're totally all right, and I could go into that saying, or in response to what you just said, I would wholeheartedly agree with there always at least being the potential of something marvelous coming out of a disastrous situation. You know, because, you know, you and I have talked at length about everything I've had going on the last month or so. And it's why I don't get down about it, because I know in the end there will be something that I'll either learn from it, grow from, or I don't want to say benefit from, because there's really not anything to benefit from with that, you know, but I guess growth is really a benefit, you know, so it's hard to not say.
It is. And I think especially because it extends to others. Now, when I think about like you were saying, dealing with like loss. Now, to the individual, it is undeniably a loss. But like you say, the growth that comes from that could then help somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, my wife is a wonderful example of that. I often call her my hero. She's an amazingly strong person because of having to overcome a lot of adversity and challenges and so forth. And I often tell her that the value that she brings to people's lives, it doesn't, I think, lessen the pain of her past any in some ways, but at the same time, it allows her to strengthen people here in the present and in the future. And that's a wonderful gift. And certainly I try and live my own life that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much like your wife. I won't dive into stuff while we're talking here. We can talk after about
Yeah.
Dealt with a lot of crap throughout my life from when I was knee high to a grasshopper till now. But all of it has allowed me to be able to help to spot when someone's in a similar situation and freaking out and be like, dude, calm down. You're going to be all right. I'm going to help you through this. And it's the coolest thing to be able to do that rather than get embittered by it. It's, but my question to pull it back into our conversation was about the poster-sized map of Thorpe and what that all entails. Because I think if I understand it right, you've got every building in the town denoted on that map.
I do. I have every little town, every little building, and every little building has a little NPC in it with a little adventure waiting to happen. Because DCC is DCC, I didn't worry about the challenge rating of those adventures. So you never know if you're going to like drop by, the armorer's place and he all of a sudden wants you to go fight a dragon, as opposed to, going up to the keep and they just want you to clear out a few kobolds. But yeah, no. And the map was really, I should say, I think something for the fans and for myself. I don't know who necessarily would want to put up a poster-sized map of Thorpe, but exactly, but a lot of people have wanted to put up a poster-sized map of Thorpe, and it was just a dream come true to have Stefan do it. This was a village that's like thrived in my imagination for like 2.5 years, and for, in essence, my favorite artist to craft that was amazing.
Yeah, that would probably, like, I don't really, the stuff I have trapped in my head that I've got to get out for games and adventures aren't really towns. But I imagine if I ever developed an entire town and then had, like, Stefan, for example, lay it all out, that would be like a really emotional experience for me to see my world put in front of me, It's like, because it's always been in your imagination, and then to actually see it in a tangible form has just got to be so like, oh, this is so cool to actually see it, where in your head you've known that on the 3rd Street second house was Grandma Tilly's pies.
Yeah.
But no one else knew it. But now you're able to like bring that all to the world. And that is just so freaking cool, man.
Yes. And it's such an exhilarating aesthetic. Like I've used, I think it was like Wonder Draft or Dungeon Draft or one of the programs that's easy for mapping to come up with a map of Thorpe, but it's pixels, it's nothing particularly inspiring. And, here, as I say, is somebody that I think he's an amazingly talented artist. I mean, he's so distinct, and to have it rendered by him was phenomenal. I mean, I feel similarly, I should say, about, to go back to your initial question about Tale of Two Sisters, working with this guy by the name of Alexander Moore. Alexander kind of just fell into our laps by happenstance, but he was the one that's done portraits of one of the two sisters. Her name is Kylie Thistledown, and it shows the progression. And to have his artistic style, where he has a style that I've said to him reminds me of graphic novels or comic books, very much so, but with like greater artistic depth, because he comes from a fine art background. And in particular, one of the things that he does is his character is going to have very subtle emotion showing on their face. Like he does, for lack of a better term, he does agony very well. And so here's this character that like he first drew her at like age 13, looking terrified, surrounded by these dead goblins, and now has done her at age 22, surrounded by like, in essence, dead corpses in the wreckage of her town at the end of Feast of the Goblin Winter. You know, very, very changed by the experience, like much more harsh and whatnot. And it's nice to see that character have evolved. And in the same way that it's awesome to see Thor brought to life by Stefan. And one thing is a funny story. So Stefan is always so very considerate. He sends in 2 versions of the map to me, and he says, well, I did a hand-lettered one where he basically wrote like, you know, beekeeper or like, you know, wheat farm and so forth by hand on the map. And he's like, but I didn't think my handwriting was very clear. So I did another version where I just typed it out in like Futura font, you know? And I was like, dude, we're totally using the handwritten one.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know? For the artistic one, that's going to be, and then we'll use the other one for like battle maps and so forth.
Yeah, I imagine you want the handwritten to kind of have that medieval feel about it. Like,
yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Another thing Stefan did was alternate covers for both of these adventures. What can you tell me about those? Like what scenes, again, I'll say without giving too much away, but what scenes do the alternate cover art depict?
So funny you mentioned that. And given that this is Games with Dave, and I want to say that the spirit here is one of total candor, I'm going to let the skeletons out of the closet or the moths out of the chest. Here it goes. So the actual story of that is that I had met with Stefan at Gen Con, and I'm like, dude, we're kicking ass with this adventure path. Your art is integral to getting people to follow the project and so forth. So if you can, let's do the color art for at least one of the covers in advance of when the launch is going to be. And the launch is going to be on November 11th, because number one, that's my wife's birthday. And number two,
that's my birthday.
No shit, you're a Veterans Day guy?
I am. I'm a V-Day baby.
Well, that's amazing. You're a magical breed, Dave.
Yeah, I always got my birthday off from school. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I never had to play hooky.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, hey, look, a belated happy birthday to you. That's amazing. So yes, so that's why I launched it on your birthday at 11 a.m. And so he was, of course, obliging. He's like, yeah, absolutely. I'll do the covers ahead of time. And so he did a sketch of the one that you have in the background, which is Hunters of the Goblin Grove. And I'm like, it's awesome. I love when he does mob scenes. They're always very frenetic and so forth. Yeah. He has this affinity for, I think, the more base sides or monstrous sides of human behavior that comes out so well. So I was like, you have to do this scene, right? And he, of course, did so brilliantly. And then for the next one, he's like, I'm going to do this sketch. So he does a sketch of, in essence, the last battle in Feast of the Goblin Winter. I said, this is fantastic, approved, right? And so I'm watching his Facebook, in the days hence, and I see that he's looking at these bottles of like really blue drink at the market. And he's like, I'm inspired, right? On the blue drink bottles. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I like the post, and go on with life and whatnot. And then I see that he's doing this beautiful painting that's like deep blue. It's the same blue as the bottles, right? And it's this winter scene, and this fiery woman is rising out of the logs and whatnot. I'm like, that's really cool and whatnot. And then he tells me, like, there you go. Like, that's the image for Feast of the Goblin Winter. And I was like, but that's nothing like the sketch that I approved. It has nothing to do with the final battle. Like, so I spend one night, and of course he's like, no, don't worry, I'll do another. I'm like, yeah, no, you're good. It's an amazing piece. But so I sleep sort of that night, and I wake up the next morning being like, oh my God, alternate cover. Like, what am I even talking about? Like, this is amazing that he did this. So I immediately email, and I'm like, Stefan, like, don't do anything with that painting. Like, hold on to that painting. And so he's doing a painting based around the original sketch, and now we have the alternate cover, and I am drafting an adventure that fits that, which is phenomenal because that does two things. One, there's a real good friend of mine who was involved in the story of Thorpe back in the day when we were playing Dungeons and Dragons. So back when, like, even before this came to DCC, there's a guy by the name of Brian Goodell, wonderful dude. I could tell you stories for the duration of an episode about him. And he had this one character named Keth. And Keth was kind of like the town lout. I don't know. Have you ever seen Dazed and Confused?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Okay. So Keth was basically like Matthew McConaughey's character, the one who was just like, you know, all right, all right, all right. Like, that was his whole vibe. Like, he would just like go to the inn and get high and drunk and then go like fight a bunch of orcs. So that was Keth's deal. And so finally I get to write like a little adventure with Keth in it. And the premise of the adventure is that because of the apocalyptic is a little bit strong, because of the cataclysmic events of Feast of the Goblin Winter that descend on Thorpe, Keth is not caught up in the battle. He's off at like a party off at a campsite, and he decides to go and pursue this one legend with the player characters who are Keth's pals to find the Fire Witch, which is the character rising out of the fire on the alternate cover that Steph did. Now, I cannot look at the cover that Stefan did and not think of Return of the Fire Witch, which is basically a passage on one of my favorite prog rock albums, the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson.
Yep.
Which I was like, okay, I love this song. The notion of the Crimson King fits so well with like the land of the Fae and this figure almost like in Santa Claus colors and whatnot. I am totally going to write an adventure that's an homage to Court of the Crimson King and Return of the Fire Witch. So basically, the exclusive piece of content that's in the alternate cover version is a mini adventure where the player characters go with Keth to go find the Fire Witch and bring her back to save Thorpe.
That is so cool.
Thank you.
I love how you took something that wasn't initially a part of it and made it a part of it just from seeing that image, and to hear that he was inspired by Blue Bottles to make awesome. That is just like, that is the coolest freaking story. Like, yeah, that is so neat. And it's so interesting, the things that will ignite inspiration within people, for be it blue bottles or the color of the sky in a sunset or something like that. It'll just like, it's so cool. So we've talked a bit about Stefan and Alexander. Who are some of the other artists that you've worked with throughout this AP?
Well, at the outset, I had the privilege of working with Brad McDevitt, which was phenomenal. He's a terrific guy, and he is, you know, they talk about like the hardest working man in show business. Like, Brad is most definitely the hardest working man in the DCC art corral. We had some really good chats. He did art for the first piece. Other artists that I've been working with, I worked with a guy by the name of Brett Hess, who I cannot wait to work with again. Brett is always supportive of projects, always sharing it on his social media. Long story short, there is he's getting an art career going and has always been an artist. He's very much into collage. His work reminds me of like sort of like 1980s heavy metal album covers and whatnot, like the early deep track kind of stuff.
Yep.
It's always like ghastly and colliding with stuff with all this ornate detail and whatnot. I didn't have the ability, unfortunately, to bring him on for the Goblin Holiday Bundle, but definitely looking, as I said to him recently in an email, for opportunities next year to bring him on to projects that are like really well suited for that kind of ghastly, ornate artwork that he does. And I'm thrilled to see that he's actually got an alternate cover, speaking of alternate covers, on Bob Brinkman's current crowdfunding project.
Nice.
And also had a really cool experience where this one artist by the name of Carol Peluso reached out from the UK. She had actually found Witch Pleas as a brand, and I believe she messaged my wife on Instagram or something and was like, I love your brand, I love your mission, so on and so forth. As fate would have it, she got a job around the time that she had signed on to work with work on the Goblin Holiday Bundle, and couldn't, unfortunately, take on that work. But fortunately for us, she knew an artist by the name of Bruno Cesar Vitorino, who's down in Brazil, who's been amazing. He's similar to Brett in the sense that, like, trying to start up his career as an artist. He's done work with the folks at Paizo, and so he knows his way around some gaming art and whatnot. And his work is really phenomenal. I shared some of it recently on the Kickstarter. He did a Leshy and he did a Water Spirit, both of which were like pitch perfect, really awesome images.
Very cool. And I love the fact that you've got these folks just kind of, for lack of a better term, kickstarting their careers.
Yeah,
right? It's like
it feels like Team Witch Pleas. It feels like we're growing. Now, granted, Stefan is definitely the grande, but he is certainly part of Team Witch Pleas.
Yeah, that's got to be so cool. Like, I've got to buckle down and get some of my ideas down on, well, I shouldn't say get them down on paper. I've got one down into 30 pages of notes now, but we'll get to that at another time.
Absolutely.
While we're still talking about this, can you kind of go over the different pledge levels and what folks can get? Because I saw recently that you are going to be putting out some absolutely gorgeous dice that I'm going to have to get my hands on. So for folks that maybe haven't backed yet, that have been watching or tune in the next like 12 or so days that this is still going, can you go over the pledge levels and let folks know what they'll get at the different levels? Yeah,
sure. I went into this with a mind of trying to accommodate different audiences. So for those that want to support the project, perhaps want to get into it gradually, or perhaps don't have the means to go all in, I do have single book levels, so as well as PDF levels. So there's the digital only level, there's the PDF bundle level where you get the Goblin holiday modules. Again, that's Feast of the Goblin Winter and Hunters of the Goblin Grove together. And then there are individual offerings for Hunters and Feast. But naturally, of course, there's a bundle that includes them both, so that they're both available at a discounted price. People get the digital and the print version. There's also a level where the alternate cover is involved. And the alternate cover, I think it's significant to note, is a single run. We are absolutely committed to never printing this sucker again. So basically, what we print is what we print. And granted, we here at Witch Pleas will get some extra copies for someday down the road. But like, this is, we hope to be a true collector's item. So
that's sick.
There's that, and then there's a level which is basically for those new to the series, where the first, second, and third, namely Champions of the Goblin Market, Pilgrims of the Goblin Road, and Pirates of the Goblin River, are also available at a heavily discounted price, along with the two new modules, so that if you haven't heard of this before and you want to get into it and get the whole thing, that's available to you. And then finally, there's a tier that, as you mentioned, you can have everything new, either with the dice or without the dice. And that's for people that, much like yourself, have been supporters for a long time. They don't necessarily want to get the older modules, but they don't want to miss out on any of the newer stuff, including the alternate cover. And so they can get that all together. So that's the all new, all in, or the all new, no dice level. The dice in particular are one of those that's an add-on. The add-ons are the dice, the poster, and the alternate cover. And so the dice, I'm blessed to say, are coming from Norse Foundry, which is a really awesome group that jumped at this chance. I got an email from somebody high in the organization being like, let's do this. I'm going to give you some price charts. We'll get you samples right away. They are going to be Goblin green dice emblazoned with the Witch Pleas logo on the one pip. And the notion is that we'll do this upon the completion of all of our adventure paths with a dice themed to the adventure path.
That is so cool. Excuse me.
Should be. We're psyched.
Yeah, that is so cool. And those dice are absolutely gorgeous. Next time we talk, I'm going to have like a slideshow made up to throw up on the screen so I can bring stuff up as we're talking about it. I've
Love
got to
it.
get better at doing that. So, I feel like there's a lot more we could cover about this, but what I'd like to do, if you're up for it, is kind of hand the reins over to you for a few minutes and let you kind of
Right.
give a brief synopsis of each of the 5 adventures for
Yeah.
the newer folks out there. And I'm just going to kick back and listen, and don't worry about it taking 5, 10, 20, or whatever minutes you need to take to kind of really, yeah, let people know what it's all about, really. I mean, I know
All
we
right.
kind of did the elevator pitch at the beginning, but I'd really like to let you. I think this is such a cool AP that, and for anyone just tuning in that's new to role playing games, AP is Adventure Path. I have a horrible tendency of just using the lingo of the industry without thinking of any new people watching. But yeah, have at it, my friend. So.
You bet. Could I ask to perhaps involve the parallel adventure path, the one that's focused on dungeon crawling, Descent of the Ancient Fame, because they kind of
Yeah,
coordinate their stories.
you do what you got to do, my friend. I'm all for it.
Let's do this. All right. So it all starts off with the level 0 adventure, Champions of the Goblin Market, and again, if there was to be a through line for all of this adventure, it kind of references what we were talking about, namely trying to seek some sort of a value out of tragedy. Because one of the core themes that I want to convey through this work is that heroes don't choose to be heroes most often than not. They are not very fortunate people. I mean, they're fortunate perhaps to have lived. Maybe they're fortunate in terms of loot. But if we actually think about what these characters go through in a DCC adventure, it's hell on earth. And so the story starts off, you have 2 girls, one's 12, one's 13. They are respectively Maddie and Kylie Thistledown in the town of Thorpe. It is Midsummer's Eve. Kylie wants to go see the preparations in town. She doesn't want to have to watch her little sister while she plays. And so she lets Maddie go off on her own. Maddie gets grabbed by goblins. Kylie, feeling guilty, grabs a bow, a cloak, and goes after her. Now, the experience of the players is that they just know that the 2 girls disappear. Now we start dropping spoilers. There is, at this point, that's going to change, but at this point, really no mechanical opportunity in the end of that adventure, Champions of the Goblin Market, to save Maddie. She's basically already off to the Goblin Mountain by the time the adventure concludes. And so Kylie, feeling bad, becomes the hero that is always trying to redeem herself as well as to save her sister. We then go forward to Pilgrims of the Goblin Road. The reasons that the people are on the pilgrimage, as I say, can be rolled up on that roster of reasons, and players can choose what their characters share and what they don't of those. But the reason that Kylie Thistledown is on the pilgrimage to the equivalent of Canterbury, which is a town called Chaucer, because I feel that not enough people know about Chaucer and Canterbury Tales anyway, so I can be pretty on the nose about it. So the reason she's on the road to Chaucer is that her mother has recently converted to the religion of the warrior pope. Her town, Thorpe, is largely what we would consider to be sort of a nature worship town, but there's a lot of religious strife in this setting. And so the faith of the warrior pope is basically sort of like a crusader kind of faith, right? And of course, the mother wants vengeance because she's lost her daughter and so forth. And Kylie's like, you know what, in order to bond with mom and maybe get God on my side, I'm going to go over to Chaucer and I'm going to redeem myself. So she's on the trek there. Now, what happens during that is that the goblins attack. They attack the caravan because they feel that certain things have been stolen from them, these various artifacts on the road, which they claim are rightly theirs. An important thing to note about this is that the goblins, every phase of the way, feel that they're the victim. Yeah, they kidnapped Maddie. However, they are completely invaded by the player characters in the first adventure. You know, people just barge into the goblin market, and invariably it ends in a whole bunch of bloodshed. So the goblins are feeling like they're the aggrieved party here. And it's the same case as in the end of Pilgrims of the Goblin Road, where they're trying to recover these artifacts, and the player characters, again, almost invariably prevent that and slaughter the goblins that are trying to do this. Now we switch tracks to Descent of the Ancient Fane. The whole plot of Descent of the Ancient Fane relates to the history of Western magic, and in particular summoning magic in the Western canon, which itself traces back to an apocryphal biblical text called the Key of Solomon. And in the Key of Solomon, that's where Gary Gygax got the name like Asmodeus and Beelzebub and so on and so forth. And it's basically a story about how Solomon is visited by the angels of God, and he gets this magic ring, and he can bring demons under his will, these spirits. You know, the initial concept of demons, not like horns and goat legs, but rather spirits. Right. And so he binds these spirits, and he creates the Temple of Solomon. That's how it gets created, through these horrible things that he keeps summoning and making him work for him. And it's the same thing in this. I do a lot of allusions to that canon, and the adventures are going to have a lot of references to that. But the Ancient Fane, this mega dungeon that players can explore, is based around that initial legend of the Temple of Solomon, that it's this place that was created by spirits, by demons, and things go wrong, and it gets shoved into the ground and whatnot. And again, the warrior pope, that one deity who's kind of like a crusader god, is the one that, you know, knocked it out, but it gets opened up again. The reason why I mention this is because throughout A Tale of Two Sisters, the goblins keep getting more and more power, and it's because they are increasingly dealing with these demons that have been unleashed from the Ancient Fane. And so that accounts for why goblins, which are usually pretty fragile creatures, can become a formidable opponent throughout the series of A Tale of Two Sisters, that they are, you know, holding truck with these dark spirits. So thank you for allowing me to mention that. Now on to the main AP, as you put it. So after Pilgrims of the Goblin Road, about 2 years after, Pirates of the Goblin River take place. And that is basically an adventure where I tried to turn, thank you so much, sir. I tried to turn a lot of expectations about the adventure onto its head in a very DCC way. I always wanted to do a swashbuckling adventure. I have a love of pirate tales. My aunt and I share that, and I dedicated the book to her. And suffice it to say that, you know, the characters start off at an inn in the very first scene, but that first battle takes place within moments of them entering the inn. They're ambushed. It's a truly bloody battle. I designed it and playtested it a number of times so that player characters are either on the brink of death or actually get killed every single time it goes down. Alex does a wonderful job depicting it. It's just a massacre of a horrible battle and whatnot. And suffice it to say that it turns out that goblins are behind the whole thing. Well, to go back to that notion of this adventure path being somewhat of a short story, once again, Kylie Thistledown shows up. She has not bonded with her mother. She still feels terribly guilty about her sister. And so she sought out this one halfling adventurer by the name of Ghost, who is there also hunting the goblins, in order to get training from him, insisting like, train me, because he's this veteran adventurer. So this is a level 2 adventure. By this time, both Kylie and the player characters are involved are pretty rough and tumble. They're pretty tough characters. Once they wipe out the goblin that's behind this, again, it's a situation where the goblins feel like they're the aggrieved party. They had been stealing these weapon shipments from the forces of the Warrior Pope that were arming up in this area around the Hinterwoods and Thorpe. And the reason why the Warrior Pope's people are arming up around this area, around the woods and Thorpe, is because they want to conquer the old ways. They want to crush the Fae. They want to crush the old religion. They want to bring law to the area. They see it, of course, as saving humanity from all these dark forces. But when you're the goblins and you're seen as the dark forces, all you know is that this invading military of plate mail wearing, great sword wielding fanatics have marched in your area and are burning down your houses and wrecking all your trees and so forth. So by this fourth adventure, Hunters of the Goblin Grove, which the audience can see has some pretty rough stuff is going on there, The goblins have decided that on Samhain, 2 years after the events in Pirates of the Goblin River, they're going to go to the sacred grove in the middle of the Hinterwoods, and they are going to take the sacred tree and use corruption to bend it towards their will. Well, at the same time that this is going on, forces of the Warrior Pope, this mercenary group called Mercer's Merry Band, has marched into the area because they have had it with the old religion, and they have caught wind that the goblins are up to something bad. And so, as you can see in the picture, they tie Thorpe's druid to the tree, and they basically try and torture him until he gives up the location of the sacred grove, because they're going to go in there and they're going to stop the goblins, but they're also going to wipe out the sacred grove and annihilate much of the Hinterwoods. Now, the PCs are kind of caught in this conflict, and so they can choose what side to take. Oddly enough, in one playtest, I had a group of PCs like go wholeheartedly with the Warrior Pope troops, being like, all right, let's burn this place down.
Wow.
Let's go save Mercer and his mercenaries and so forth, and wipe this place out. They were an interesting band. But suffice it to say that in the end of that adventure, most of the time, the player characters stop the guy that wields Singing Doom, stop the goblins that had taken over the sacred grove and redeem the tree. They prevent the tree from being corrupted by the goblins. So that brings us to Feast of the Goblin Winter. The goblins take another 2 years to arm up. They have absolutely had it. They've lost several of their nobles. They've lost a respected wizard in Pirates of the Goblin River, a cleric in the second one, and the guy that wields Singing Doom, a powerful knight, gets killed in the end of Hunters of the Goblin Grove. They have not prevented the forces of the Warrior Pope from settling in Thorpe, and one of the things that people will notice on Stefan's map is a huge keep called Summerhall, which is where basically the forces of the Warrior Pope have set up in the most recent years. And so the goblins say, all right, we need a solution. We're going to use our most powerful priestess, a cleric of the underworld, to bring every powerful spirit of winter to bear and just wipe Thorpe off the map. Take out the keep before it can be built, take out the Warrior Pope's forces, take out the druid that couldn't stand up to them, take them all out. Now, the catch is, I should note that the spirits of winter, you talk about inspiration, they come from, again, these books of lore back here. They're the classic manifestations of winter spirits from all the various mythologies, the bull and the witch and so forth, and of course, the troll king. They're all converging under the command of this high priestess. Well, the high priestess turns out to be, plug your ears if you're, intending this to be a surprise to people. The high priestess is Maddie Thistledown. So she had been taken by the king of the goblins, as we know in Champions of the Goblin Market. She's clever enough to kind of manipulate him. She becomes a chosen one of this dark god and just kind of leans into the role. So she blames the people of Thorpe, including her sister, for having abandoned her all those years ago. She thinks that they're all sinful and corrupt. She's on the side of the goblins. And so basically the adventure Feast of the Goblin Winter is the succession of these very complex boss fights where you have to use creative problem solving to defeat the forces of winter. The more they converge on the center of town, the more powerful they get. And so players kind of have to balance strategically which one are we going to go after first? How do we solve the problem of defeating them? You cannot defeat them just by rushing them. They'll wipe you out. And then finally, in the end, in the middle of Thorpe's religious grove, its own sacred grove, there manifests Maddie and all of her rage in the form of this thing that basically starts wiping out the town. And the more the town that she wipes out, the stronger she gets. So, yeah, that's the story. I'm glad you asked, Dave.
That is so cool. I love that plot twist.
Thank you.
I love it. That is brilliant, because I'm thinking, like Maddie's death, and then to have her be revealed in the fifth and final chapter as like, that is so cool.
Yes. And of course, her sister, Kylie, has grown up to be the protector of this town. So they're, in essence, directly at odds with one another. And I will say that one thing I want to do, in all fairness to judges out there, is in the campaign setting that I'm going to be developing over the course of next year, probably for release late 2025 or maybe early 26, I am going to do a sort of Dark Tower style mega dungeon, or Tomb of Horror style mega dungeon of Pit Reaver Mount, where the goblins live. So if you decide, all right, we're going to go through Champions of the Goblin Market, but screw it, we're throwing caution to the wind, and we're going right after those goblins up their impossible mountain, well, you now have the impossible mountain to try and explore.
That is so cool. I cannot wait.
Thank you.
Man, that is all I had for the night, my friend. What I'd actually like to do, there are a couple folks watching, is open it up to see if anyone has any questions, or if they're just hanging out and listening, which I always invite people to do. So yeah, folks watching, if you do have any questions, drop them in the chat and I'll pop them up on the screen, and we'll give that a couple of minutes. And dude, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I have had an absolute blast.
It has been a blast. I'm so glad I got to talk about this stuff with you.
Yeah, and we'll have to do this again when you launch Campfire, the campaign guide, and I just forgot the name. I had it right.
Descent of the Ancient Fane.
Descent of the Ancient Fane. So we've got at least 3 more talks lined up right there.
Oh,
so
for sure.
That's awesome.
And I'm always good to just talk about what's going on in gaming, what's going on in life in general. You know it. Invite me on anytime. It's a really great conversation.
Hell yeah. Thank you.
I will say that, so the release schedule is that Campfire is coming to come out, what I would say, like first quarter of next year. As we were saying before this discussion, I've delayed the launch somewhat, so we're going to probably kick off the crowdfunding for that in mid to late January. After that, I hooked up at Gen Con with a guy by the name of Archie Fields III. He's a philosophy professor from University of Calgary, and for the last 3 years, he's taught what he calls Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy, which is basically a series of D&D adventures that have a philosophical concept at the heart of them. So it could be like the trolley dilemma, the nature of the self, Theseus' ship, what have you. He's actually blessed us by signing with us. So he's coming out with The Witch is Weird. That's going to be like early summer, ideally speaking. And then we have some stuff later in the year, including the campaign setting. So
I giggled when you said the philosophy, because I'm picturing like the allegory of the Goblin Cave, or something along those lines. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions here, so I will let you get back to your evening. Thank you again so much for coming on, and for the folks that tuned in, thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed our chat. If you did, give the episode a thumbs up. Maybe think about subscribing or leaving a comment. And other than that, folks, have a happy Thanksgiving, and I will see you next time. Have a good night.
Have a great one. Happy Thanksgiving.